One of the key highlights of OpenAI's announcement on June 13 has been function calling. The function calling capability has been announced for both GPT 3.5 and GPT 4. To use this capability, we need to set the model type to be either GPT 40613 or GPT 3.5 Turbo 0613, depending on whether we are using GPT 3. Depending on whether we are using GPT 4 or GPT 3.5. With function calling, we can connect external tools and APIs to GPT. The announcement blog talks about three scenarios where function calling can be used. So one is the scenario where we can connect external tools or APIs to answer questions for the chatbot. Other is the scenario where we can convert natural language into API calls or database queries. And the third scenario that they are talking about is extracting structured data from text. In a series of videos, I'll be talking about each of these scenarios. We start with the external API calling use case, and the link to the notebook where the use case is implemented is shared in the use cases section. So there are a couple of prerequisites for running this notebook. So the first one is getting a OpenAI API key. So in case you don't have it, you can get one at the website platform.openai.com. And in this example, I'll be using a weather API call. So this is an external API call. And to get the weather information, we need an API key. So there are multiple websites which you can use for getting the weather information. I have used the openweathermap.org site, and for this website, I got the key from home.openweathermap.org/API keys. So you can use either this website or any of the other weather API service providers. And in the interest of time, I have pre-run this notebook, and the results are already there, and I'll be just taking you through them. The first step is to install and import the required libraries. For this notebook, we need to install OpenAI and python.env. We then go on to import the required packages in Python. And what I have done is I have used all the keys in a file called .env, which I have put inside the env files folder here. So an important point to note here is that never use your API keys directly in the code, because in case you share it with somebody or upload it in some public forums, your key would be compromised. So the first step, as always, is to read the keys from the environment file. So we do that using the .env package. And the weather API key is loaded into weather underscore API underscore key variable. And the OpenAI API key is loaded into OpenAI API key variable. And before we start, we'll first write the function get current weather. And what this function does is it takes the name of a city as input, and it outputs the temperature in Kelvin format. So it's in Kelvin format because I'm using the API from Open Weather Map. Different websites might give you temperature in different formats, and you need to be aware of them and do the required conversions. So what happens in the get weather function is it takes in two variables. One is a location and the other one is a unit. And within that, we call the Open Weather Map API. And to call this API, we need the weather API key as well. And the response is obtained in the weather data as a JSON variable. And from that, we need to pick up only the temperature because here we are returning only the temperature value to the user. Right? And what I have done here is I have created a JSON as the output, which is the weather info, and it basically returns the location, the temperature, and the unit. So I'll start with the temperature. So as I said, this specific API returns the temperature in Kelvin. So we need to convert it into either Celsius or Fahrenheit. So that's why we have the variable conversion factor. And in the output, you also see something called unit. So as with any function, as soon as we write it, we need to test it. So here I'm just doing a get current weather for Bangalore, and the unit I'm giving it as Celsius as we use Celsius in India. So you see that the response is a JSON with three parameters. So one is the location, which is Bangalore. Then we have the temperature, which is around 21.9, and the unit is Celsius. Right. Now let's get into the OpenAI function calling. So again, if you go back to the blog, you see that there are three different steps in the function calling. So first is they say call the model with functions and the user's input. Second one is use the model response to call your API. And the third one is send the response back to the model to summarize. So here what I have done is I have split the three steps into different sections for the ease of understanding. So we have already defined the current weather function, and we need to basically have a JSON where all the available functions are listed, right, along with the name of these functions. So that is done in this variable called available functions, and the function that we defined earlier, the get current weather, is defined here, and the name that we are using for it is get current weather. Now we set the OpenAI's API key because these are the set of things that we need to do before we call the chat completion API. So first is setting the OpenAI API key, and the second one is the message. So here I'm kind of not reading the input from the user. Instead, I'm kind of hard coding it here in the message. So the message that goes into chat creation API, it says, you know, what is the weather like in Boston? Now comes the most important part where we define the functions. So the functions are typically defined as an array where each element of the array is one function. And for a function, we need a name, which is the get current weather. You need to note that whatever value you put in here should map the key in the available functions JSON. Then you have a description, which basically says what this function is used for. So it says get the current weather in a given location. So that's what get current weather does. And then we have something called the parameters. So in parameters, we have something called properties, and it is within properties that we define the parameters that are required, right? So, first one is location. So, what is location? So, and what is its type? So, the location is of type string, and its description says the city and the state. And then we have something called unit, which is again of type string, and the description is like the unit system for temperature used at location. So if you look at the description and then go back into what we have described in the content, right? So the content is a statement in English, a natural language, which says, what is the weather like in Boston? As in, we are not specifying what is the location, and we are not specifying what is the unit, right? But at the same time, we are giving the description for location as the city and the state, and the unit as the unit system for temperature used at location. And let's see, what happens when we call the OpenAI function here. So if you look at it, let me scroll it down a bit. Yeah. So if you look at it, we call the OpenAI chat completion create API. We specify the model as GPT 3.5 Turbo. The message is what we have described here, with role as user and content as what is the weather like in Boston. And then we specify the functions, and then we specify the function call as auto. And then when we run it, what happens is the API gives us a response where um, it goes through the functions that have been defined, and it checks the user input against each of these functions, and then it gives, in its response, it says which function has to be called. And along with that, the most interesting part is it kind of tells you what are the different arguments and the values of these arguments that we should use for the function call. So from a sentence like, what is the weather like in Boston? We get an output like, call the get current weather function. And the parameters would be basically location as Boston, MA, and the unit as Imperial. So how is it able to map all of these things? So that's where the power of description comes in, right? So say it knows that we need to call the get weather function because of the description here, get the current weather in a given location. And it's able to identify the location as the city and the state, because that's what we have specified. So we could either specify the state in the query, or just give the city name over there. But from the information that we have given and the descriptions that we have provided, the GPT model is able to figure out that the location is Boston and the unit is Imperial. So the unit could either be Imperial or metric. In India, we use the metric system, which translates to the temperature in degrees Celsius, whereas in US, it's an imperial system where the unit is Fahrenheit. So it has kind of figured out the unit and the location. So now that we have got this information, next step is to actually call that function. So let's see how that is done. Right. So this is basically the step 2 as described in the blog. So the response message, I'm storing it in a variable called response MSG. And I'm trying to extract the name of the function to be called. So which is basically part of the function call variable, right? So we have a function name, and this is basically extracted from response message, function call, and name. And then what is the function to call? So this is, we get it from the available functions JSON that we had described earlier. Then we have something called the function arguments. So this is basically obtained from the arguments JSON, which is location and the unit. So we have got the arguments and the function name. Next step is to actually call the function, right? And this is obtained or this is achieved by making the function to call and providing it with the two parameters. Now, let's look at what went into the step and what is the output of the step. So what into went, and the step 2, we started with the response message. So which was basically the response from the first API call. So we asked the chat completion API, what is the weather in Boston? And the assistant replied that, the role is assistant, and it said that we have to make a function call with the name of the function is get current weather and the arguments. And then we did a function to call with the function name as well as the parameters. And this is the response that we have got. So the location is Boston, the temperature is 54, and unit is imperial. This is basically, the response or the JSON response from the get current weather API that we had described earlier. Now we come to the third step, which is send the response back to the model to summarize. So again, what we do now is the response message that we got earlier from the bot, we add it to the messages. And then we append to the message, something then we append to the message the function response. To do that, we specify the role not as a user or an assistant, but we specify the role as a function. And the name we specify as the function name. And in the content, we give the function response, which is basically the response that we have obtained from the API call. And then what we do is Okay, so I'm not a robot, and let's continue. So next what we do is, once we have appended the response, the first response from the bot, as well as a new message with the role function, we again call the chat completion API. We specify the model to be 3.5 and the message to include what we have appended now. And note here that we don't use the function call anymore, because we have already used the functions and got the response. And then we get something called the response to user. So what does this response contain, right? So here we have an ID, and then we have an object, and there's a model that's being used, and the response is out here, right? So the role is assistant, and the content says the current weather in Boston, MA is 54.08 Fahrenheit. So this is a response that will go back to the user in case we are using a chatbot. So with this, we come to the end of example of the first scenario. In subsequent videos, I'll be taking you through other examples as well as give an implementation of the same function calling using LangChain. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.